He looked at me like I was her. His eyes, clouded by disease, didn't see his 15-year-old granddaughter standing before him. They saw Eunice, his wife who had died 5 years ago. And my family asked me to just smile and accept it when his wrinkled hands began to roam over my body. My name is Dolores Quinn Albright. I'm 83 years old today, and I'm known in Millstone, a small town in rural West Virginia, as Miss D, the midwife who brought more than 2,000 children into this world in our Appalachian Valley. Those who see me now, with my immaculate white bun and my hands that still know exactly how to soothe a restless baby, would never imagine the hell I lived through as a teenager. A hell created not by a stranger, but by my own grandfather, a man transformed into a monster by disease, and by the silence of a family who preferred to sacrifice my innocence rather than face a painful truth. I was born in 1941. In a simple clapboard house nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. Our house was set apart from the small downtown of Millstone, almost at the county line. It was an old construction with thick walls that kept in the cool even on the hottest days, small dark wooden windows, and a huge backyard where my mother grew a little bit of everything: potatoes, corn, beans, and medicinal herbs that she knew like the back of her hand. We were a simple family, but we never lacked food on the table. My father, Jerome, worked in the coal mines, like so many other men in the region. He'd leave before sunrise and return with his skin covered in black dust, his calloused hands always carrying some special rock he'd found to give me as a present. My collection of coal and minerals was my greatest childhood treasure. My mother, Isabella, was known in the region for her knowledge of herbs and prayers. She wasn't an official midwife like I would later become, but she helped with difficult births when called. It was from her that I learned to recognize plants by their smell, to make tinctures for almost all ailments, to understand the cycles of the moon and how they affect women's bodies. I had a happy childhood, running free along mountain trails, swimming in the creek, helping my mother with her plants, and listening to the fantastic stories my father told about hidden treasures from the early pioneer days. Our house was simple, but it was always full of neighbors who came asking for medicine, a prayer, or simply to sit around the wood stove on cold mountain nights. That tranquility ended in 1956, when I was 15 years old. That's when my grandfather Abraham, my father's father, came to live with us. Grandpa Abraham had been a respected man in Millstone, owner of a small hardware store downtown, a deacon at the Baptist church, known for his moral rigidity and strong temperament. I didn't know him very well before then. He and my grandmother Eunice lived downtown, and we only visited them on special occasions. My grandmother had passed away 5 years earlier in 1951, and Grandpa had continued to live alone in their house, with the help of a housekeeper who went there every day. But then the forgetfulness started. First, small things, where he'd left his keys, the name of an old customer, whether he'd already had lunch or not. Then, more serious things, leaving the stove on, going out in his pajamas, accusing the housekeeper of stealing objects that he himself had put away and couldn't remember where. It was when he nearly set fire to the house, forgetting a candle lit near the curtains, that my father decided he could no longer leave him alone. "He needs constant care," my father explained one night after dinner. "He's going to come live with us." If anyone at that table could have foreseen the future, perhaps they would have suggested another solution. But nobody could. And so Grandpa Abraham arrived one April morning with his few suitcases and his eyes already half lost in time. Our house wasn't large, but it had an extra room we used to store harvests and tools. My father and my older brothers, John and Anthony, emptied the room, painted the walls, put in a new bed, and so Grandpa had his space. The first days were strange, but not alarming. Grandpa confused people's names, repeatedly asked the same things, sometimes spoke to my mother as if she were a housekeeper. "It's the disease," my father would say with a tired sigh. "It's not his fault." It was during the second week that I noticed something different in the way he looked at me. We were all at the dinner table when he suddenly stopped eating and fixed his eyes on me. "Eunice," he said, with a voice suddenly clearer, firmer than usual. "Why did you cut your hair? I always liked it long." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. My hair was tied in a long braid down my back, as I always wore it. I hadn't cut anything. Dad, my father said gently. This is Dolores, your granddaughter. Mom passed away, remember? Grandpa blinked a few times, confused, and then his face contorted in an expression of deep sadness. Of course. Eunice is gone. I'm sorry. He went back to eating in silence, but every now and then I caught him observing me with a disturbing intensity. In the days that followed, it happened more often. I would be sweeping the yard or helping my mother in the kitchen, and I'd hear, "Eunice, have you seen my pipe?" Or, "Eunice, come sit here with me." My father or mother would always gently correct him, and he would always seem momentarily confused, then accept the correction. Those of you listening to me now must be wondering how such a simple confusion could turn into the nightmare I'm reporting. And this is what I want you to understand. The horror didn't come all at once. It came in small moments, in small concessions, in small omissions that accumulated until it was too late to turn back. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what your name is. It's important for me to know who are the brave souls willing to listen to such a difficult story as this one. And if you can, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so that other stories like mine can be told. It's not easy for a woman my age to expose such old wounds, but I do it so that other girls don't go through what I went through. Back to my story. The change came about a month after Grandpa's arrival. It was a hot May afternoon, and I was alone at home with him. My parents had gone to town to buy supplies, and my brothers were working in the fields. I was preparing lunch, chopping vegetables in the kitchen, when I felt a presence behind me. "Eunice." Grandpa's voice sounded different. It wasn't the confused, fragile voice we had become accustomed to hearing. It was the voice of a younger, stronger man. "You look beautiful today." I turned around, knife still in hand, and saw him standing in the kitchen doorway, looking at me in a way that made me feel as if I were naked. It wasn't the vague, lost look of the sick old man. It was a look of desire, a look that traveled over me from head to toe as if undressing me. "Grandpa, it's me, Dolores," I said, feeling a chill down my spine. "You're confusing me again." He smiled in a way I had never seen before, a smile that didn't belong on my grandfather's kind face. "Don't be silly, Eunice. I would recognize my wife anywhere." He took a step toward me, and I instinctively backed up until I hit the table. He continued advancing until he was inches from me. I could smell his strong breath, a mixture of pipe tobacco and something bitter I couldn't identify. "Is dinner ready yet?" he asked, as if we were having a perfectly normal conversation. But his hand rose and touched my face in a way that made my stomach turn. "After dinner, we can go to bed early. I've missed you." I was paralyzed, the kitchen knife now useless in my trembling hand. I didn't know what to do. Push him away? Scream? He was my grandfather, an elderly, sick man. He probably didn't even know what he was doing. How could I push him? How could I scream? How could I hurt him? "Grandpa, please," I begged, tears running down my fever-hot face. "I'm not Grandma. I'm your granddaughter. This isn't right." For a moment, he seemed confused. His hand stopped. His eyes blinked rapidly. "Dolores?" he murmured, and for a moment I had hope that lucidity had returned. But then he smiled again, that smile that didn't belong to my grandfather. "Don't be silly, Eunice. I know it's you. I would always recognize the smell of your hair." His hands began to move again, more insistent now, and I began to understand that I wouldn't be able to stop him with words. Gathering all the strength I had left, I pushed him away and stood up from the bed, staggering from the fever. "No!" I shouted, louder than I intended. "I'm not her! Look at me, Grandpa! I'm Dolores, your granddaughter!" He sat on the bed, looking at me with a mixture of confusion and irritation. "Why are you shouting at me, Eunice? You never used to shout before." "Because I'm not Eunice," I repeated, grabbing onto the door to keep from falling. "And you can't touch me like that. It's wrong." Something changed in his face. The irritation gave way to an anger I had never seen before. "Don't tell me what's right or wrong, woman," he growled, getting up too. "You are my wife. I have rights." I ran out of the room, stumbling down the hallway to the kitchen. He came after me, slower because of his age, but determined. I grabbed a heavy pan that was on the stove and turned to face him. "If you come near me," I threatened, my voice trembling, "I'll hit you with this." He stopped a few steps away, his face contorted in an expression that mixed anger and confusion. "What happened to you, Eunice?" he asked, and there was genuine sadness in his voice. "Why are you treating me this way?" Before I could answer, the front door opened, and my mother entered, followed by my father and brothers. They stopped, surprised by the scene they found, me, in my nightgown, holding a pan like a weapon, and my grandfather, standing in the middle of the kitchen, looking completely lost. "What's going on here?" my father demanded, looking from me to my grandfather and back to me. He tried to, I began, but the words wouldn't come out. How to explain? How to make them understand? "Eunice is acting strange today," my grandfather said, suddenly seeming small and fragile again. "She doesn't recognize me. She's threatening me." My father sighed deeply and approached my grandfather, putting an arm around his shoulders. "Dad, this is Dolores, your granddaughter. Let's go back to your room, okay?" As my father led my grandfather away, my mother approached me. I put the pan on the table and collapsed into a chair, trembling uncontrollably. "What happened?" she asked, her voice now softer. Between sobs, I told her everything. How he had entered my room, how he had lain down beside me, how his hands had roamed over my body. My mother listened in silence, her face growing paler. When I finished, I expected her to hug me, to promise me that this would never happen again. Instead, she sat down across from me and held my hands in hers. "Dolores," she said, in a low voice so that my brothers, who were in the living room, wouldn't hear. "You need to understand that your grandfather is very sick. He really believes you're his wife in those moments. It's not his fault." "But Mom," I cried, incredulous. "He tried. He was going to—" "He doesn't know what he's doing," she insisted, squeezing my hands tightly. "It's the disease, not him. The grandpa you know, who told you stories, who gave you gifts, that man would never harm you." "So what do we do?" I asked, feeling a growing despair. "I can't be alone with him. I can't." My mother sighed, and I saw the weight of an impossible decision in her eyes. "We'll be more careful. You won't be left alone with him anymore. And maybe it's better if you don't directly contradict him when he's confused. Just distract him, change the subject, until the confusion passes." It wasn't the answer I wanted. It wasn't the protection I needed. But at that time, in that place, with the little we knew about the disease consuming my grandfather's mind, it was the only solution my family could find. And so began a period of my life where I learned the art of dodging, of making myself invisible, of always having an excuse not to be where my grandfather was. I learned to read the signs, the way his eyes changed when the confusion began, how his posture altered, how his voice became different when he saw me as Eunice. For a few weeks, it worked. I was always surrounded by someone from the family, always vigilant, always ready to escape at the first sign of danger. But the constant vigilance took its toll. I slept poorly, startling at the slightest noise. I lost my appetite. My grades at school, which had always been good, began to fall. The happy, carefree girl I had been was disappearing, replaced by a frightened shadow who jumped at the slightest touch. And then inevitably came the day when all precautions failed. It was on a Sunday afternoon that everything changed. The sky was heavy, announcing a storm that would soon break over Millstone, and the air had that tension that precedes great thunderstorms. Our family had gone to service at the Baptist church, as we did every Sunday. Grandpa Abraham usually accompanied us, but that day he had woken up with leg pains and stayed home. On the way back, it began to rain, first a few fat drops, then a deluge that forced us to run the rest of the way. We arrived home soaked, laughing and complaining at the same time, as you do when rain catches you by surprise. My brothers went to change clothes, my father went to check on Grandpa, and my mother began to prepare Sunday lunch, which would be fried chicken with biscuits and gravy, my favorite. I went to my room to change my wet dress for something dry. I was in my slip, looking for clean clothes in the trunk at the foot of the bed, when my bedroom door opened. I turned, startled, expecting to see my mother, but it was Grandpa Abraham standing in the doorway, looking at me with that expression I had already learned to fear. "Eunice," he said, with a clear and firm voice, so different from the trembling voice he used in moments of lucidity. Why didn't you wait for me to help you take off your dress? I quickly grabbed a sheet to cover myself, my heart racing. Grandpa, it's me, Dolores, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You're confused again. But he was already entering the room, closing the door behind him. Always so shy, even after so many years, he smiled, approaching. That's what I've always loved about you. I looked frantically at the door, calculating if I could get past him and escape. He was old, but he was still a strong man, accustomed to years of hard work. And I was cornered between him and the wall. Grandpa, please. I tried again, now with a trembling voice. My parents are home. My brothers, they'll come in any moment. Let them come in, he replied, with a disturbing confidence. I am your husband. We're not doing anything wrong. He took another step toward me, and I tried to back away, but my back was already against the wall. His hands, wrinkled but still strong, grabbed my arms with surprising force. Grandpa, no, I begged, tears already streaming down my face. I'm your granddaughter. This is wrong. Please. For an instant, something passed through his eyes, a flash of confusion, perhaps even recognition. But then his face hardened. I don't know what game you're playing, Eunice, but I'm tired of it. You are my wife, and you will fulfill your duties. His hands moved to my neck, not to strangle me, but in a gesture that was both affectionate and controlling. His thumbs traced my throat in a way that made me want to vomit. That's when the door opened again, and my father entered the room. Dad? What are you doing here? Grandpa Abraham turned without releasing my arms and answered naturally, I'm with my wife, son. Why the surprise? My father visibly paled, looking from me to his father and back to me. I was trembling, the sheet barely covering my body, tears now flowing freely. Dad, my father said with forced calm, this is Dolores, your granddaughter. My daughter, not Mom. Grandpa looked at me, confused, and then at my father again. What are you talking about, Jerome? Of course it's your mother. Look at her. My father slowly approached, like someone approaching a frightened animal. Come on, Dad. Come with me. It's time for your medicine. To my relief, Grandpa released my arms and allowed my father to guide him out of the room. Before leaving, my father gave me a look that mixed concern, sadness, and something else. Shame, perhaps. I collapsed on the floor as soon as the door closed, hugging my knees, trembling uncontrollably. A few minutes later, my mother entered, carrying a mug of chamomile tea. Your father told me what happened, she said, sitting beside me and offering me the mug. Drink this. It will calm your nerves. I accepted the tea with trembling hands, but I couldn't stop crying. Mom, I can't take it anymore. He won't stop. It's getting worse. My mother sighed deeply, and I saw tears in her eyes too. I know, honey. I know. What are we going to do? I asked, clinging to this admission like a lifeline. He can't stay here. It's not safe. She remained silent for a long moment, looking at her own hands. It's not that simple, Dolores, she finally said. We don't have money to put him in a nursing home, and even if we did, there isn't one nearby. The closest is in Charleston. Then send him to Charleston, I exclaimed, with more force than I intended. He needs care we can't give. With what money, honey? She replied, and there was a hardness in her voice that surprised me. You know how much your father makes in the mines. It's barely enough to support us. A nursing home in Charleston would cost more than we earn in 6 months. And what about me? I asked, my voice low now. What is the cost of what I'm going through? I saw the pain in my mother's eyes, a true, deep pain. She was trapped in an impossible choice, just as I was. We'll be more careful, she promised. Your father will lock Grandpa's room at night, and you will never be alone with him again. Never. I wanted to believe her. I desperately wanted to believe it would be enough, but something inside me knew it wouldn't be. The disease was progressing, the moments of confusion becoming more frequent, longer, more intense. The next morning, my father gathered the family in the living room, my mother, my brothers John and Anthony, and me. Grandpa was still sleeping, sedated by the medicines the doctor had prescribed to calm his nerves. We need to talk about what happened yesterday, my father began, his face marked by a sleepless night. The situation with Grandpa is getting complicated. Complicated, I interrupted, unable to contain my indignation. He tried to attack me, Dad. It's not complicated, it's dangerous. My older brother, John, who was 20 at the time, frowned. What exactly did he do, Dolores? Did he hurt you? I felt my face burn. How to explain? How to put into words what had happened, what had almost happened, what I feared would still happen? He confuses me with Grandma Eunice, I finally said, looking at my hands. And he tries to treat me like he treated his wife. A heavy silence fell over the room. My younger brother, Anthony, who was 17, seemed genuinely confused. I don't understand, he said. What does that mean? It means he's sick, my father intervened quickly. Dr. Matthews from Millstone said it's a disease that affects memory, that makes the person confuse the past with the present. Grandpa really believes Dolores is Grandma Eunice in those moments. So he's not doing it on purpose, concluded John, as if that resolved everything. It's the disease, not him. It doesn't matter if it's on purpose or not, I exclaimed, standing up. What matters is that it's not safe. It's not safe for me to be near him. My father stood up too, putting his hands on my shoulders. Dolores, I understand you're scared, and I promise we'll protect you. But I need you to understand something. We can't simply send him away. He's my father. He's family. And me? I asked, my voice almost a whisper. I'm family too. I saw the pain in my father's eyes, the pain of someone being forced to choose between two people he loves. We'll find a solution, he promised. We'll consult Dr. Matthews again, see if there are stronger medicines or maybe some other option we haven't considered. But as he spoke, I saw something in his eyes that told me he already knew there was no other option, that we were trapped in this impossible situation, at least for now. In the weeks that followed, my family made a genuine effort to protect me. My room got a lock, which I used religiously. I was never left alone at home with Grandpa. There was always someone with me, usually my mother or my brother Anthony, who had taken on the responsibility of watching his grandfather when the others were busy. Dr. Matthews, an older man who was the only doctor in Millstone at the time, increased the dosage of the medications that Grandpa was taking. This made him more drowsy, less prone to episodes of confusion, but also less like the grandfather I had known and loved. He spent most of the day sitting on the porch, staring at nothing, occasionally mumbling names of people who were no longer with us. For a time, it seemed we had found a precarious balance. The incidents decreased. I still recoiled when he looked at me in a certain way, still felt nauseous when he called me Eunice, but the physical advances had stopped. And then came my 16th birthday in October 1957. It was a special occasion in our house. We didn't have money for big celebrations, but my mother always made a point of preparing a cake and a special meal on each of our birthdays. That day, she had made my favorite cake, chocolate with buttercream frosting, and had killed a chicken for lunch, a rare luxury at our table. My father had given me a new dress as a present, sewn by my mother with a floral cotton fabric that he had bought in town. It was the first new dress I had received in years, and I was radiant. After lunch, my father and brothers went out to work in the fields. There was a corn crop that needed to be harvested before the heavy rains that were predicted for the following week. My mother went to the creek to wash clothes, a task that usually took the entire afternoon. Keep an eye on Grandpa, she told me before leaving. He took his medicine after lunch, so he should sleep all afternoon. But if you need anything, come down to the creek and call me. I nodded, not very worried. Grandpa really did seem drowsy, almost asleep in the rocking chair on the porch. And I had plans for the afternoon. I wanted to try on my new dress, maybe braid flowers into my hair like I had seen the town girls do. I spent the afternoon in my room, humming softly as I got ready. The dress fit perfectly, the floral cotton contrasting with my tanned skin. I braided my hair with some flowers from the yard and even put on a bit of the lipstick I had received as a gift from my friend Teresa, saved for special occasions. I was admiring myself in the small, cracked mirror we had when I heard my bedroom door open. I hadn't locked it, certain that Grandpa was sleeping on the porch. But there he was, standing in the doorway, looking at me with an intensity that made my blood freeze. "Eunice," he said, and his voice had none of the drowsiness from the medications. It was clear, strong, full of an authority that I had learned to fear. "You look beautiful today." I got up quickly, trying to get past him and out of the room. "Grandpa, it's me, Dolores. Today is my birthday, remember? I'm wearing the new dress I got." He blocked the door with his body, his eyes never leaving mine. "I know exactly who you are," he said, and there was something different in his voice now, something I couldn't identify. "And I know today is a special day." He took a step toward me, and I backed up until I hit the wall. There was nowhere to run. The room was small, the only exit blocked by his body. "Grandpa?" I tried again, my voice trembling. "My mother will be back soon. And my brothers. They won't be back so soon," he interrupted, with a certainty that terrified me. "I saw your mother going to the creek with a big bundle of laundry, and your brothers and your father are in the fields, harvesting corn. We have the whole afternoon to ourselves." Panic began to take over me. He had planned this. He had pretended to be drowsy, had waited for everyone to leave, had been watching me. It wasn't just the confusion of the disease acting. There was calculation. There was intention. "Please," I begged, tears already streaming down my face, smearing the borrowed lipstick. "Please, don't do this. I'm your granddaughter. Your granddaughter." He was inches from me now, his hot breath on my face. "I don't know what game you and Jerome are playing," he said, his voice now hard, "but I'm tired of it. You are my wife. You have duties to fulfill." His hands grabbed my arms forcefully, and I felt his nails digging into my skin. I tried to scream, but he covered my mouth with one hand, the other still holding my arm. "Don't scream," he ordered, his face inches from mine. "There's no one to hear anyway." At that moment, something inside me broke. Fear gave way to an anger I had never felt before. With all the strength I could gather, I bit the hand that covered my mouth, tasting the metallic flavor of blood. He screamed in pain and backed away, looking incredulously at the mark of my teeth on his skin. I took advantage of the moment to try to get past him and reach the door, but he was faster. He grabbed my hair forcefully, pulling me back with such violence that I fell to the floor. "Ungrateful slut," he growled, with a voice that didn't belong to my grandfather, to the man who had told me stories, who had given me colorful pebbles when I was a child. "I'll teach you to respect your husband." What happened next is something I spent decades trying to forget. His hands tearing the new dress I had received that day, his weight on top of me, immobilizing me, his panting breath, his eyes clouded not by disease, but by a sick desire. And the pain, physical, yes, but mainly the pain of a betrayal so deep, so incomprehensible, that it broke something inside me that would never be completely repaired. I don't know how long it lasted, minutes or an eternity. When it finally ended, he stood up, adjusted his clothes, and looked at me as if I were a broken object, something that had lost its value. "Clean yourself up," he ordered, his voice cold now. "I don't want your mother to find you like this and start asking questions." And then he left, closing the door behind him, leaving me on the floor, curled up like a wounded animal. I don't remember much of what happened afterward. I know that at some point I dragged myself to the wash basin in the corner of the room and tried to wash myself, scrubbing my skin until it was red, as if I could clean not only the physical marks, but the stain I felt on my soul. I know I burned the torn dress, unable to bear the sight of it, and put on old clothes. I know that when my mother returned from the creek, she found me sitting on the bed, staring at nothing, unable to speak, to cry, to feel anything. "What happened?" she asked, alarmed by my state. "Dolores, what happened? Where is your new dress?" I couldn't answer. The words were stuck in my throat, as if speaking would make real what had happened, as if naming the horror would make it even more unbearable. It was only when she approached and touched my face that the tears finally came, not in dramatic sobs, but in a silent and constant flow, as if a dam had broken inside me. "It was him, wasn't it?" she asked, and the resignation in her voice broke me even more. "What did he do, Dolores? Tell me." He confused me with Grandma," I finally managed to say, my voice almost inaudible. "But he wasn't confused, Mom. He knew. Somehow he knew. He waited for everyone to leave. He planned it." My mother paled, her hands trembling as she held mine. "Did he hurt you?" she asked, although her eyes already knew the answer. I nodded, unable to say more. She hugged me then, pressing me against her chest as she did when I was little and had nightmares. But this nightmare wouldn't end upon waking. This nightmare had just begun. When my father and brothers returned from the fields, my mother was waiting for them on the porch. I was lying in my bed, curled up like a ball, my body sore, my mind numb. I heard their voices, first in normal tones of conversation, then my mother's voice louder, insistent, then my father, incredulous, denying. Then silence, followed by heavy footsteps toward Grandpa's room. What followed were shouts. My father, furious as I had never heard him before, and Grandpa, first confused, then defensive. I heard the sound of something breaking, then my brothers trying to separate the two, my mother crying. Later, much later, when the house had finally fallen into a heavy silence, my father came to my room. He sat on the edge of my bed, his face marked by tears and by an expression that mixed anger, guilt, and a pain so deep that it made me feel guilty for being the cause of it. "Dolores," he began, his voice hoarse, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to ask forgiveness for not protecting you." "It wasn't your fault, Dad," I replied automatically, the words coming out without emotion, as if I were talking about someone else, about a story I had heard, not lived. "Yes, it was," he insisted, tears flowing freely now. "I should have listened to you before. I should have realized the danger. I should have—" His voice failed, and we sat in silence for a long moment. "What's going to happen now?" I finally asked. My father took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. "Tomorrow I'm taking him to Charleston. There's a hospital there that can take care of him. I've already talked to Dr. Matthews, and he's going to give us a referral letter." "With what money?" I asked, remembering the previous discussions, the reason why we hadn't done this before. "It doesn't matter," he replied, with a firmness that didn't admit discussion. "I'll find a way. I'll sell whatever is necessary, work twice as hard, but he won't be under the same roof as you anymore. Never again." I wanted to feel relief at these words, but I was too numb to feel anything. I just nodded, closing my eyes, wishing sleep would come and take me away from this unbearable reality. The next morning, I woke to the sound of raised voices coming from the living room. I got up with difficulty, my body still sore, and approached the door to hear better. "You can't do this, Jerome." It was Grandpa's voice, clearer and more lucid than I had heard it in months. "You can't send me to an asylum like I'm crazy. You're sick, Dad." My father's voice, controlled but firm. "You need care we can't give here. It's because of that absurd story Dolores made up, isn't it?" Grandpa continued, his voice now indignant. "You're going to believe her instead of your own father?" I felt my stomach turn. He was denying it. He was using his moments of lucidity to deny what he had done, to make me look like a liar. "It's not made up," my father's voice, now harder. "I saw the bruises. I saw the torn dress she tried to hide. She must have fallen," Grandpa insisted. "Or maybe it was that boy, Sebastian's son, who's always looking at her. You know how girls are these days, Jerome. They make up stories to cover their own shame." I couldn't take it anymore. I opened the door forcefully and entered the living room, confronting the man who had destroyed my life, who was now trying to destroy my reputation as well. "I didn't lie," I shouted, trembling with anger. "You know exactly what you did. You waited for everyone to leave. You planned everything." Grandpa looked at me with an expression of offended innocence so convincing that, for an insane moment, I almost doubted my own memory. "What are you talking about, girl?" he asked, his voice soft now, his eyes clear, lucid. "I would never hurt you. You're my dear granddaughter." I took a step toward him, unable to contain the fury growing inside me. "Don't pretend you don't remember. You called me Eunice. You tore my dress. You—" "Dolores, enough," my father interrupted, placing himself between us. "Go back to your room. I'll handle this." "But Dad, he's lying," I insisted, tears streaming down my face. "He's pretending he doesn't remember." "I know," my father replied, in a low voice so only I could hear. "I know he's lying. And that's why he's leaving today, one way or another." I looked into my father's eyes and saw a determination I had never seen before. He believed me. He was on my side. For the first time since it all began, I didn't feel completely alone. I went back to my room, and hours later, I heard the noise of the wagon that would take my father and grandfather to the train station in Millstone, from where they would go to Charleston. I didn't come out to say goodbye. I had nothing to say to the man who had stolen not only my innocence, but also my trust, my sense of safety in the world. When the wagon moved away, I felt a relief so intense that I collapsed on the floor, sobbing. My mother found me like this and knelt beside me, hugging me in silence. There were no words that could fix what had been broken, no promises that could erase what had happened. There was only the comfort of her presence, the warmth of her arms, the certainty that, at least for now, I was safe. But physical safety didn't mean emotional safety. The horror of what I had lived through didn't disappear with my grandfather's departure. On the contrary, it seemed to grow, occupying every corner of my mind, infiltrating my dreams, turning them into vivid nightmares from which I woke screaming in a cold sweat. And gradually, I realized that it wasn't just the trauma of the abuse that haunted me. It was also my family's reaction before the worst happened, the way they had minimized my fears, how they had asked me to be patient, how they had placed the comfort of a sick man above my safety. If they had listened to me before, I thought one night, as I looked at the dark ceiling of my room, unable to sleep, none of this would have happened. If they had taken me seriously from the beginning, I wouldn't be here now, broken like this. And it was this thought that planted the seed of what would come next. Not just the struggle to overcome the trauma, but also the struggle to be heard, to be taken seriously, to ensure that no other girl went through what I had gone through. But that struggle was just beginning, and the road ahead would be even more difficult than I could imagine. Before I move on to the next part of my life story, I wanted to know if you're still watching. Many people can't hear me talk for more than 5 minutes, so if you're one of the people who are watching with sweetness in your heart, leave your like and comment. I'm listening to you, Miss D. Thanks to all for your attention, my loves. In the weeks that followed my grandfather's departure for the hospital in Charleston, our house was taken over by a heavy silence. It was as if no one knew what to say, as if words could break the fragile normality we were trying to rebuild. My father returned from Charleston with a face aged 10 years, carrying a burden of guilt that not even my mother could alleviate. He had left Grandpa admitted to a place called State Hospital, a facility for the mentally ill that, according to him, was the best we could afford. The money for the admission came from the sale of the land my father had inherited on the outskirts of Millstone, a small plot that he had been saving to expand our farm someday. "It doesn't matter," he said, when my mother expressed concern. "Nothing matters more than Dolores's safety." Those words should have comforted me, but the damage had already been done. The poison had already spread. The demon had already entered our house, disguised as old age and disease, and had left its mark on all of us. The nightmares began almost immediately. Night after night, I woke up screaming, my body soaked in sweat, my trembling hands trying to push away an attacker who only existed in my mind. My mother would come running, hug me, murmur words of comfort, while my father stood at the door, helpless, his eyes full of a pain he didn't know how to express. During the day, I tried to pretend I was fine. I returned to school a week later, determined not to let what had happened completely destroy my life. But I wasn't the same Dolores who entered that classroom. The cheerful, talkative girl, always with her hand raised to answer the teacher's questions, had been replaced by a silent shadow who shrank when any man, whether the math teacher, the elderly janitor, or the older boys, came too close. My friends noticed the change, of course. Teresa, my best friend since childhood, tried several times to find out what was happening. "You're not the same, Dolores," she said one day as we walked home after school. "What happened? You can tell me." I wanted to trust her. I wanted to share the terrible weight I was carrying. But the words wouldn't come. How to explain the inexplicable? How to make someone understand the complexity of that horror? Not a stranger on a dark street, not a monster from the stories they told to scare us, but my own grandfather, a man I had once loved, who was sick, who perhaps didn't even really know what he was doing. "I'm just tired," I replied, avoiding her eyes. "I haven't been sleeping well." She didn't believe it, of course. No one believed the flimsy excuses I gave to explain the deep circles under my eyes, the weight loss, the startling at the slightest noise. But no one insisted too much, perhaps for fear of what they might discover. At home, the situation wasn't better. My brothers, who had always been noisy and playful, now measured every word, every gesture, as if I were made of glass and could break at any moment. John, the oldest, could barely look at me, carrying his own guilt for not being there to protect me. Anthony, the youngest, sometimes tried to make me laugh with his usual clowning, but his smile never reached his eyes, which were always alert, worried. My father sank into work. He left before dawn for the mine and only returned after dark, too exhausted to do more than eat in silence and fall into bed. On Sundays, when he normally rested, he found extra work as a loader at the Millstone Market. "We need the money for the hospital," he explained, although we all knew it was more than that. It was an escape, a penance, a way of not having to face what had happened under his roof. My mother was the only one who really tried to help me deal with the trauma. On nights when the nightmares were worse, she would sit on the edge of my bed and softly sing the same lullabies from my childhood. During the day, she included me in her tasks, collecting medicinal herbs, preparing tinctures, visiting pregnant women who needed her advice. It was her way of showing me that life went on, that there was still beauty and purpose in the world. But even with these efforts, I felt increasingly isolated, increasingly distant from everything and everyone. It was as if an invisible wall had been erected between me and the rest of the world. I could see people on the other side. I could hear their voices, but I couldn't really connect. I couldn't feel what they felt. The months passed. The seasons changed. The humid heat of summer gave way to the intense rains of autumn, then to the cutting cold of winter in the Appalachian Mountains. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something inside me began to change too. It wasn't a sudden cure, a dramatic revelation. It was more like a gradual awakening, a small fire of anger and determination that began to burn under the ashes of my trauma. I began to wonder, why am I carrying this shame? Why am I hiding, as if I had done something wrong? The fault wasn't mine. The mistake wasn't mine. In March 1958, about 6 months after the incident, I made a decision that would change the course of my life. I was in the yard, helping my mother gather herbs for her tinctures, when I saw a young woman approaching along the path that led to our house. I immediately recognized her as Louise, one of the most respected midwives in the region, who occasionally came to consult my mother about the properties of certain plants. I watched as she and my mother talked, exchanging information about herbs and recipes, discussing difficult cases they had attended. There was a confidence in them, a security in their knowledge, a certainty of their value in the world that fascinated me. When Louise was leaving, I plucked up my courage and approached her. "Miss Louise," I began, my voice firmer than I felt inside. "Do you think I could learn to be a midwife too?" She looked me up and down, evaluating me with experienced eyes. "How old are you, girl?" 16, I replied. "I'll be 17 in October." She nodded slowly. "You're young, but it's not without precedent. I started helping my grandmother with births when I was your age. Are your hands good?" I extended my hands for her to see, calloused from hard work, but agile and sensitive like my mother's. "I think so." "And your stomach? Is it strong?" "Childbirth is not for the weak." I thought about everything I had faced in recent months, the horror I had survived. "My stomach is stronger than it looks." A brief smile crossed her face. "I believe it. There's something in your eyes, girl. Something I've only seen in women who have known suffering up close." She paused, considering. "Come to my house on Sunday after church. We'll see what you're made of." And so began my training as a midwife. Every Sunday, after church, I would walk to Miss Louise's house in the center of Millstone. There, she taught me about the female body, about the stages of pregnancy, about the signs of imminent birth. She showed me her tools: silver scissors to cut the umbilical cord, herbs to relieve pain, oils to facilitate birth. And most importantly, she taught me about trust, the trust a midwife needs to inspire, the trust she needs to have in her own abilities, the trust in the natural process of birth. "Childbirth is not a disease," she always repeated. "It's the most natural process in the world. Our job is not to interfere, it's to facilitate. It's to give the woman the strength and knowledge to bring her child into the world safely and with dignity. The first birth I attended was in June 1958. It was a cold night, and the rain was falling heavily when Mrs. Genovese's daughter came knocking at our door, asking for help for her mother who was in labor. Miss Louise had told me to call her if any emergency arose, but the storm had made the roads to the center of Millstone almost impassable. "I'll go with you," I told the young woman, quickly gathering the herbs and instruments that my mother kept for emergencies. "Send someone to get Miss Louise, but we can't wait." My mother looked at me with a mixture of concern and pride. "Are you sure, honey?" I wasn't, but I knew Mrs. Genovese needed help now, not when the storm abated. "I am, Mom. I'll do what I can until Miss Louise arrives." Mrs. Genovese's cabin was a half-hour walk from our house in a small clearing on the mountainside. When we arrived, she was already in advanced labor, moaning in pain, her face covered in sweat despite the cold of the night. "The midwife is coming," I assured her, placing my hands on her belly to feel the contractions, as Miss Louise had taught me. "I'm here to help until she arrives." In Mrs. Genovese's eyes, I saw fear, but also trust, not in me, who was practically unknown to her, but in the knowledge I represented, in the tradition of women caring for women that had existed for generations in these mountains. The birth was quick and without complications. Even before Miss Louise could arrive, I had already helped bring a healthy, robust boy into the world, had cut the umbilical cord with trembling but sure hands, had placed the child in the arms of the exhausted but radiant mother. When Miss Louise finally arrived, soaked by the rain and worried, she found me cleaning up the blood and birth fluids, the baby already contentedly nursing at his mother's breast. "It seems they didn't need me after all," she commented, examining my work with critical but approving eyes. "You have a gift, Dolores, a real gift." That night changed something fundamental inside me. For the first time since the abuse, I felt I had a purpose, a skill that could make a difference in the world. I felt that my body, which had been violated and marked by violence, could also be an instrument of healing and life. And most importantly, I felt that the power that had been taken from me could be recovered. Not in the same way, never in the same way, but in a new way, transformed by the fire of experience. In the months that followed, I accompanied Miss Louise to dozens of births. Gradually, my reputation began to spread, first as Miss Louise's helper, then as the young midwife, and finally, simply as Dolores the midwife. The women of the region began to seek me out directly, especially the younger ones, who felt more comfortable with me than with the older, more traditional midwives. My family observed this transformation with a mixture of pride and concern. My mother supported my new vocation unconditionally, often accompanying me on the most difficult births, sharing her own knowledge of herbs and remedies. My father, although proud of the respect I was beginning to earn in the community, feared that the work was too heavy for me, that I had not yet fully recovered from the trauma. "I don't want you to exhaust yourself, honey," he would say, on the rare nights when we managed to sit together around the table. "You're still young, you have time." But I knew I couldn't wait. Working as a midwife wasn't just a vocation for me, it was salvation. Each baby I helped bring into the world was a small victory against the darkness that had threatened to consume me. Each woman I supported in her moment of greatest vulnerability and strength was a reminder that the female body was not just an object to be used and discarded, but a miracle of creation and resistance. It was during this period that I began to develop a deeper understanding not just of childbirth, but of the entire cycle of female life. I learned about herbs that could regulate the menstrual cycle, relieve the pains of childbirth, prevent unwanted pregnancy. I learned to recognize the signs of abuse and violence in the bodies and spirits of the women who came to see me. And most importantly, I learned to listen, really listen, to their stories, their fears, their dreams. I realized that many of them carried wounds similar to mine. Some had been abused by husbands, by fathers, by brothers. Others had been forced into marriages they didn't want, into lives that slowly suffocated them. All, in one way or another, knew the experience of having their power stolen, their voice silenced, their body treated as someone else's property. And gradually, almost without realizing it, my work as a midwife began to expand. It was no longer just about bringing children into the world. It was about creating safe spaces where women could speak without fear, where they could share their pain and find paths to healing. At 18, in 1959, I rented a small room behind Mr. Gerald's pharmacy, in the center of Millstone. It wasn't much, just enough space for an examination table, some shelves for my herbs and instruments, and 2 chairs for conversations. But it was mine. The first space I could truly call my own, the first place where I established my own rules. Women's House, I called it, although there was no sign on the door, just knowledge passed by word of mouth among the women of the region. There, I attended women of all ages and conditions, from frightened girls with their first menstruation to elderly women dealing with the discomforts of menopause. There, I heard stories that would never be told elsewhere, kept secrets that would never be shared with pastors or doctors or husbands. And there, finally, I began to confront my own story. Not all at once, not in grand, dramatic gestures of catharsis, but slowly, piece by piece, like someone untying a particularly difficult knot. I realized that part of my isolation came from the sense of singularity of my trauma, as if what had happened to me was so unique, so specific, that no one could ever really understand. But listening to the stories of other women, I began to see patterns, connections, a larger fabric of female experience of which my story was just one thread. It doesn't mean the trauma became easier to bear. Some nights, I still woke up screaming, my body covered in cold sweat, the sensation of wrinkled hands on my skin so vivid that I needed to light the lamp to make sure I was alone. Some days, I still instinctively recoiled when a man passed too close on the street, or when I heard a male voice raised in anger. Some moments, I was still overtaken by a wave of nausea, so strong that I had to stop what I was doing and breathe deeply, counting slowly to 10 to drive away the memory that threatened to engulf me. But these moments became less frequent, less intense, and, more importantly, I began to develop tools to deal with them when they came. Deep breathing, calming herbs that I prepared myself, simple rituals of cleansing and protection that had as much psychology as spirituality. The work at the Women's House grew rapidly. Soon, I was attending not just women from Millstone, but also from villages and farms in the surrounding area. Some traveled days to see me, bringing stories of mysterious pains that no doctor could diagnose, of marriages that were disguised prisons, of daughters who showed disturbing signs that they feared to name. For some, I could offer practical solutions, herbs to regulate the cycle, techniques to avoid pregnancy, remedies to relieve chronic pain. For others, all I could offer was an attentive ear, an understanding that came not from books or theories, but from my own lived experience of trauma and recovery. And for some, not many, but some, I helped plan escapes. Women whose husbands beat them regularly, girls whose fathers or brothers touched them in ways that made them feel dirty and broken. For these, I used my growing network of contacts, other midwives, nuns from the convent in the mountains, merchants who traveled to larger cities, to find safe places, new beginnings, different identities if necessary. It wasn't work without risks. More than once, furious husbands came knocking at the door of the Women's House, demanding to know where their wives had gone. Pastors criticized me from the pulpit, not mentioning my name directly, but speaking against those who interfere in the sacred bond of matrimony, or who promote pagan practices under the guise of folk medicine. The town doctor, Dr. Matthews, looked at me with a mixture of contempt and curiosity when we crossed paths on the street, clearly resentful of the preference many women showed for my more natural and respectful methods. But for every voice that rose against me, there were dozens of women who whispered my name with gratitude, who defended my work, who brought me simple gifts, a handful of fresh eggs, a piece of embroidered fabric, a fat chicken for Sunday. And it was this support, this invisible but powerful network of female solidarity, that sustained me during the most difficult years. The most painful, ironically, came from where I least expected it, from my own family. Not from my mother, who continued to be my most fervent supporter, but from my father and brothers, who began to distance themselves more and more as my work became more known and controversial. For my father, it was the shame of having a daughter who openly defied traditional expectations for a young woman from a good family. "It's not natural," he would say, on the rare occasions when we touched on the subject. "A girl your age should be thinking about getting married, having her own family, not—" He would make a vague gesture with his hand, unable to name exactly what I did that disturbed him so much. For my brothers, it was more complex. John, the oldest, was building his own reputation as a respectable merchant in Millstone, and my growing fame, or infamy, depending on who was speaking, was beginning to affect his business. Anthony, the youngest, was courting a girl from a traditional family, and her parents made it clear they didn't look kindly on the connection with the family of that midwife who meddles where she's not called. Gradually, visits to the family home became rarer, more tense, marked by uncomfortable silences and superficial conversations that carefully avoided any mention of my work or my independent life in the center of town. Only my mother maintained regular contact, visiting me at the women's house at least once a week, bringing not only supplies of herbs and medicinal plants from our old yard, but also news of the family, stories from the neighborhood, pieces of the world I had left behind. It was during one of these visits in February 1960 that she brought me the news I both feared and expected. My grandfather had died in the hospital in Charleston. "It was peaceful, according to what they said," she related, sitting in the wicker chair in my small consultation room. "He simply didn't wake up one morning. The doctor said it was probably his heart." I remained silent, unable to name the storm of emotions stirring inside me. Relief, yes. The guilty relief of knowing that the man who had violated me no longer existed, that he could never hurt me again. But also a complex sadness for the grandfather who had existed before the disease, the man who told me stories, who gave me colorful pebbles, who had been, in his limited way, loving. "Your father wants you to go to the funeral," my mother continued, studying my face carefully. "It will be tomorrow, at the Millstone Cemetery." The idea of standing before the coffin of the man who had destroyed my adolescence, of hearing the pastor speak about his exemplary life, his dedication to family, his unwavering faith, it was unbearable. But I also knew that refusing would be a final break with my father, a cut that perhaps could never be repaired. "I can't, Mom," I finally replied, my voice almost a whisper. "I understand that Dad wants me to be there, that appearances need to be maintained. But I can't stand before that coffin and pretend grief for a man who—" My voice failed, unable to complete the sentence. My mother nodded, without surprise. "I told your father you probably wouldn't go. He's hurt, but I think, deep down, he understands." I doubted that. My father had never really understood, or perhaps had never wanted to understand, the depth of the trauma I carried, the complexity of my relationship with my grandfather's memory. For him, the matter had been closed when Grandpa was sent to the hospital. The problem had been solved, the page turned, and now we should all move on as if nothing had happened. But it didn't work that way. Trauma didn't respect social convenience, didn't conform to expectations of decorum and appearances. Trauma had its own logic, its own time, its own way of remaining alive long after its source had been removed. And it was this understanding, this visceral awareness, born of experience, of how trauma shapes and transforms a life, that became the deepest foundation of my work with other traumatized women. It wasn't just the technical knowledge of herbs and massages and birthing techniques that made me effective. It was the ability to look into the eyes of a broken woman and say, with complete honesty, "I know, I understand. I've been there too." And so, through isolation and pain, through the slow and imperfect reconstruction of my own life, I found a path not just to survive, but to transform my suffering into something that could help others survive too. Not a complete cure, never that, but a purpose, a direction, a way to extract some meaning from the senseless horror that had been imposed on me. In the years that followed, this direction would become clearer, this purpose more defined. But the road would still be long. There would still be many battles to be fought, some with the outside world, but the most difficult always with myself, with the ghosts that would never completely leave me, with the 16-year-old girl who still lived inside me, still frightened, still confused, still asking, Why didn't anyone protect me when I needed it most? The year 1960 marked the beginning of a new phase in my life. With my grandfather's death, I felt as if a dark chapter had been closed, although the scars remained. The women's house was flourishing. My name was already known throughout the valley, and I had just turned 19, too young for the responsibility I carried, but too old in experience and pain. It was during this period that I met the person who would change my understanding of what had happened to me and open doors I didn't even imagine existed. Her name was Dr. Helen Sutton, one of the first female doctors trained at the West Virginia School of Medicine. She had come to Millstone to work at the newly inaugurated health post, part of a state government program to bring medical care to the most remote regions. Our first meeting was tense, to say the least. She had heard about the young midwife who attended women in questionable conditions, as she herself said later, and came to the women's house with the clear intention of assessing whether I represented a danger to public health. I clearly remember the expression on her face when she entered, a mixture of curiosity and distrust, the intelligent eyes behind thin-framed glasses observing every detail of my modest office. "So you're the famous Dolores," she said, without extending her hand for a greeting. "I've heard a lot about your work, and I've heard about yours, doctor," I replied, maintaining my composure despite the knot in my stomach. Doctors represented authority, and authority still made me tremble inside, an automatic reflex conditioned by trauma that I doubted would ever completely disappear. "Welcome to the women's house." She walked around the small space, examining my shelves of herbs, my meticulously clean instruments, the worn books on medicinal plants and anatomy that I had managed to buy with my savings. She picked up a bottle, smelled its contents, raised an eyebrow. "Artemisia, to regulate the menstrual cycle?" I nodded, surprised that she recognized the herb. "And also to facilitate childbirth in specific dosages." She continued her examination, commenting on other herbs, asking about my techniques, my sterilization methods, my way of diagnosing complications. Gradually, her tone changed from distrust to genuine interest, and I realized I was facing a truly curious mind, not just an authority looking for flaws. "Where did you learn all this?" she finally asked, sitting in the chair normally occupied by my patients. "It's not the kind of knowledge easily found in books." "From my mother, from Miss Louise, the older midwife of the region, and from every woman I've ever attended," I replied honestly. "Some things are in books, others come from experience, from tradition, from knowledge passed from woman to woman for generations." She studied me for a long moment, as if making an important decision. "I came here expecting to find a charlatan," she finally admitted. "Instead, I found someone practicing a form of medicine that academia rarely recognizes, but which has its own rigor, its own validity." That was the beginning of an unlikely partnership between the capital-trained doctor and the self-taught midwife from the countryside. Dr. Helen began to send me patients, women with problems that conventional medicine couldn't solve, cases that required a more holistic approach, more integrated with the realities of rural life. In exchange, I began to refer to her cases that were beyond my capabilities: serious obstetric complications, infections that didn't respond to herbs, women with injuries that needed surgical intervention. But our relationship went beyond professional cooperation. Dr. Helen became the first person with whom I could speak openly about the trauma I had suffered. Not all at once, not in a great cathartic confession, but gradually, in conversations that happened on quiet afternoons, when the day's work was done and we shared a cup of chamomile tea in the small back room of the women's house. "What you're describing," she said one day, after I had revealed another piece of my story, "has a name in the medical literature. It's called psychological trauma. It's a wound in the mind, as real as a wound in the body, although many doctors still refuse to recognize it. The idea that what I felt, the nightmares, the startling, the moments of inexplicable panic, was not weakness or madness, but a natural response to a terrible experience, was revolutionary for me." Dr. Helen lent me books, articles, case studies. For the first time, I saw my experience reflected in terms that didn't diminish me, that didn't blame me, that offered a path to understanding, if not to complete healing. "You're not alone in this, Dolores," she told me on one of those afternoons. "There are women like you all over the world carrying similar wounds. and there are people studying ways to help them heal those wounds. It was Dr. Helen who first suggested that I consider seeking formal education. You already know more about the female body and childbirth than many doctors I know, she argued. Imagine what you could do with proper training, with access to resources you don't have now. The idea seemed absurd at first. Me, a country girl who had barely completed primary school, attending college? But the seed was planted, and over the following months, it began to germinate. In July 1961, I made a decision that shocked not only my family, but the entire Millstone community. I announced that I would go to Charleston to study nursing at the School of Nursing, one of the most respected in the state. The reaction was immediate and, for the most part, negative. My father, with whom I barely spoke since my grandfather's funeral, came to the women's house for the first time, his face red with indignation. "Have you lost your mind?" he questioned, his voice raised enough for the women in the waiting room to hear. "Abandon everything you've built here to go study in the capital? With what money? Where will you live? And who will take care of the women here while you play at being a city girl?" His anger didn't surprise me, but his concern for the women here caught me off guard. It was the first time he had recognized, even indirectly, the importance of the work I did. "It's not a whim, Dad," I replied, keeping my voice calm despite my racing heart. Confrontations with male authority figures still left me in a state of alert, a conditioned reflex from trauma that I doubted would ever completely disappear. "It's an opportunity to learn more, to bring new knowledge here when I return." "If you return," he corrected, his gaze hard. "The big city changes people, Dolores. You think you'll want to come back to this backwater after tasting life in Charleston?" It was a legitimate concern, I realized, not just about my departure, but about my possible non-return, about the fear of losing me completely, not just to physical distance, but to a world so different from ours that I would become unrecognizable. "I will return," I promised, and at that moment, I truly believed it. This is my home, my work, my mission. I just want to have more tools to accomplish it better. He didn't seem convinced, but his next question was practical, not emotional. "And the money? The school isn't free, and Charleston is expensive." "I got a scholarship," I replied, unable to hide my pride. "Dr. Helen helped me with the application, and I have enough savings to support myself for the first year until I can get a job to supplement." He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his face changed. Not exactly acceptance, but perhaps a reluctant recognition that I was no longer the girl he could control, that I had become a woman capable of making her own decisions, however much he disagreed with them. "Does your mother know about this?" he finally asked. "Yes. She was the first person I talked to." He nodded slowly. "She always believed in you more than any of us." He paused, as if gathering courage for something difficult. I should have believed too. From the beginning, I knew he wasn't just talking about my decision to study, but about everything. The warnings I had given about my grandfather, the danger I had foreseen, and that no one had taken seriously until it was too late. It was the closest to an apology I would get from him, and I accepted it for what it was. Imperfect, incomplete, but sincere. "There's still time," I replied simply. The time in Charleston was transformative. The School of Nursing was a world apart. Modern buildings, renowned professors, laboratories equipped with technology I had never seen before. In the first days, I felt completely out of place, a country bumpkin lost in the big city. My colleagues came from educated families, had studied in good schools, spoke with a sophistication that made me even more aware of my heavy country accent. But I soon discovered that I had something many of them didn't possess: practical experience. While they only read about childbirth in books, I had already brought more than 100 children into the world with my own hands. While they debated theories about female diseases, I had already treated hundreds of women with real problems, using limited resources and a lot of creativity. This experience didn't go unnoticed by the professors, and soon I was invited to share my knowledge in practical classes. It was during my second year at the school that I met Dr. Robert Allen, a psychiatrist who occasionally gave lectures on mental health to nursing students. Unlike many doctors of the time, he took psychological suffering seriously, especially that of women. When he learned of my experience, both as a survivor of abuse and as a midwife who attended other traumatized women, he invited me to attend some of his therapy sessions. "What you're doing instinctively at the Women's House," he told me one day, "is a form of therapy that we're just beginning to understand formally. You create a safe space where women can talk about experiences that society prefers to silence, and that, in itself, is therapeutic." With Dr. Allen, I learned about the new studies on psychological trauma, about ways to help survivors rebuild their lives, about the importance of validating their experiences instead of minimizing or pathologizing them. And perhaps most importantly, I learned that what had happened to me wasn't an isolated case, an aberration, but part of a much larger pattern of violence against women and girls that society preferred to ignore. In one of our conversations, he mentioned a concept that would forever change my understanding of what had happened in my family. What you describe, the way your parents initially minimized your fears, how they asked you to be patient, how they placed your grandfather's well-being above your safety, is something we see repeatedly in families where abuse occurs. We call this the dynamic of the dysfunctional family system. The idea that it wasn't just my grandfather who had harmed me, but an entire family system that had allowed the abuse to happen, was both painful and liberating. Painful because it implied that my parents, whom I loved so much, had failed me in a fundamental way. Liberating because it meant there wasn't something intrinsically wrong with me, that any child in that system would have been equally vulnerable. "The problem wasn't with you," Dr. Allen insisted. "The problem was with the system that prioritized the appearance of normalcy over the safety of the most vulnerable, that valued the convenience of adults more than the well-being of children." Armed with this new understanding, I decided it was time for a definitive confrontation with my family. Not an angry or accusatory confrontation, but an honest conversation about what had happened and how it had affected me. An opportunity to heal not only myself, but also the relationships that had been damaged by silence and denial. At Christmas 1963, I returned to Millstone for the first time since I had left to study. The bus journey through the winding roads of the Appalachian foothills gave me time to reflect on everything that had changed in me during those 2.5 years. I was no longer just the self-taught midwife, but a professional with formal education, with both a technical and emotional understanding of human suffering. And perhaps most importantly, I was no longer a silenced victim, but a survivor who had found her voice. My childhood home seemed smaller than I remembered, more aged. My mother waited for me at the door, her face lit up with a joy that made my heart ache. She had aged too, more wrinkles around her eyes, more gray strands in her hair that was always tied in a bun. But her embrace was the same, strong and secure, smelling of herbs and freshly baked bread. My father was more reserved, observing me with a mixture of pride and unfamiliarity, as if he wasn't quite sure how to approach this new version of the daughter who had left. My brothers, both married now, came with their wives and small children, nieces and nephews I barely knew, who looked at me with curiosity, wondering who this aunt was who lived in the big city. Dinner was a mixture of comforting familiarity and unresolved tension. We talked about safe subjects, the weather, the crops, the town news, my studies, carefully avoiding the elephant in the room. The trauma that had divided our family, the wounds we had never openly discussed. It was only after the children were put to bed, when we were all sitting in the living room around the small nativity scene that my mother set up every year, that I found the courage to say what I had come to say. "I need to talk to you about what happened," I began, my voice firmer than I felt inside. "About Grandpa. About that last year he spent with us. About how it affected all of us." A heavy silence fell over the room. My mother lowered her eyes. My father visibly stiffened. My brothers exchanged uncomfortable looks. No one wanted to have this conversation, especially on Christmas Eve. But I knew that, if not now, it might never happen. "What happened to me wasn't just a personal tragedy," I continued, carefully choosing my words. "It was the result of choices we all made, or failed to make. You chose to ignore the signs because it was easier, more convenient than facing the terrible truth that Grandpa posed a danger to me." "Dolores, please," my father interrupted, his voice tense. "It's Christmas. Can't we leave the past in the past?" "No, Dad," I replied, firmer now. The past never stays in the past when it's not confronted, when it's not acknowledged. It continues to live inside us, poisoning our relationships, preventing us from really knowing each other. Your sister is right, John. My older brother surprised me by speaking up first. We've pretended for too long that nothing happened. We thought if we didn't talk about it, the pain would disappear. But it didn't disappear. It just buried itself deeper. From there, the floodgates opened. My brother confessed the guilt he carried for not protecting me, for being complicit in the silence imposed by my father. My sister-in-law revealed that she had been abused by an uncle as a child and had never told anyone until that moment. My mother cried, asking forgiveness for not acting sooner, for not taking me away at the first sign of danger. And my father, the most resistant of all, finally broke down. I couldn't believe it, he admitted, his voice choked. I couldn't believe that my own father, the man who raised me, who taught me everything I know, could do something so terrible. It was easier to think you were exaggerating, that it was just a misunderstanding, and when I finally had to face the truth, the weight of guilt was unbearable. How could I look at you knowing I had failed so fundamentally to protect you? You did fail me, I agreed, feeling the tears I had promised myself not to shed starting to fall. But I also know you were trapped in your own system of beliefs, in your own limitations, and I know that, in your own way, you loved me and wanted the best for me. That night marked the beginning of a reconciliation that would take years to complete. It wasn't a magical cure, it didn't erase the past, but it opened a space for honest dialogue, for the acknowledgement of suffering, for the possibility of a new type of relationship based not on carefully maintained silences, but on courageously faced truths. I returned to Charleston a few days later, feeling simultaneously exhausted and renewed. Something had changed inside me, not just in relation to my family, but in relation to myself. For the first time, I felt that I wasn't just surviving my past, but beginning to integrate it into a larger narrative of who I was and who I was becoming. In the months that followed, this integration deepened. My studies at the School of Nursing, my sessions with Dr. Allen, my regular correspondence with Dr. Helen and with my family, all of this contributed to a more complete, more compassionate understanding of what had happened to me and how I could use this experience not only to heal myself, but to help other women on their own path to healing. And it was thus, through seeking professional help, through honest confrontation with my family, and through the discovery of a new language to understand my trauma, that I finally began to free myself, not only from the horror of what had happened, but also from the silence and shame that had been almost as harmful as the abuse itself. Complete liberation was still far off, of course, but the first steps, the most difficult ones, had already been taken. Liberation and reconstruction of my life. When I graduated from the School of Nursing in December 1964, at 23 years old, I stood at a crossroads. I had offers to work in hospitals in Charleston, where I could build a traditional career with a stable salary and prospects for growth. But my heart pulled me back to Millstone, to the Appalachian Valley, to the women who had trusted me when I was just a traumatized girl trying to find purpose in pain. You don't have to choose, Dr. Helen told me, who had come from Millstone especially for my graduation. You can bring the best of both worlds, the traditional wisdom you learned from the midwives of the valley and the scientific knowledge you acquired here. And that's exactly what I decided to do. In January 1965, I returned to Millstone, no longer as the young self-taught midwife who had left, but as Nurse Dolores Quinn Albright, with a diploma recognized by the Department of Education and an expanded vision of what I could accomplish. The Women's House, which had been kept running in a limited way by Miss Louise during my absence, was completely renovated and expanded. With the help of Dr. Helen, I secured a small grant from the state government to transform it into a women's health center, the first of its kind in rural West Virginia. I didn't abandon the traditional practices that had been the foundation of my initial work, the medicinal herbs, the sitz baths, the massages to facilitate childbirth, but I integrated them with modern techniques and knowledge, proper sterilization of instruments, early recognition of complications, more effective contraceptive methods. It was an approach that respected both the ancestral wisdom of midwives and the discoveries of contemporary medical science. "You've built a bridge," Dr. Allen commented, who occasionally came from Charleston to supervise the mental health component of the center. "A bridge between two worlds that normally see each other as adversaries." This bridge extended to my family relationships as well. My parents, now aging, became enthusiastic supporters of my work. My father, especially, underwent a remarkable transformation, from critic to defender. When someone in town questioned the propriety of an unmarried woman running a health center, it was he who stood up to defend me with a ferocity that surprised even me. "My daughter saves lives," he would say, with obvious pride in his voice. "What does your son do?" My mother, always my silent ally, now worked alongside me at the center, teaching the young nurses who were beginning to join our team the traditional knowledge of herbs and natural remedies that she had learned from her own mother. Our relationship flourished in this partnership, stronger and more equal than it had ever been. My brothers, initially more distant, also gradually came closer. John, the oldest, now a successful merchant, helped establish a distribution network for a medicinal soap we developed at the center, made with local herbs, which helped prevent postpartum infections. Anthony, the youngest, who had become a teacher, regularly brought his teenage female students for lectures on reproductive health and self-care. It was Anthony who, in 1968, introduced me to Matthew, a newly qualified doctor who had come to Millstone to work at the regional hospital. Tall, with tanned skin and gentle eyes behind thick-rimmed glasses, Matthew was different from any man I had known. Intelligent without being arrogant, confident without being domineering, respectful without being condescending. Our relationship began as a professional collaboration. He referred patients to me who needed continuous care after hospital discharge. I referred to him cases that required medical intervention beyond my capabilities. Gradually, professional admiration transformed into friendship, and friendship into something deeper. Matthew was the first man with whom I felt truly safe since the abuse. The first who didn't awaken in me that automatic reflex of tension, of alertness, of preparation for danger. With him, for the first time, I could explore the possibility of intimacy without fear, of vulnerability without terror. It wasn't an easy path. Even with all the therapeutic work I had done with Dr. Allen, even with all the healing I had found through my work with other traumatized women, my grandfather's ghost still appeared at the most unexpected moments. A specific touch, a particular smell, a word said in a certain way, and suddenly I was back in that room on that day, unable to breathe, unable to move. Matthew, with a patience that seemed infinite, learned to recognize the signs, to back off when necessary, to offer presence without pressure. "Time is our ally," he would say when I apologized for another moment of panic, for another night interrupted by nightmares. "We're not in a hurry," and he was right. With time, with trust built day by day, gesture by gesture, we managed to build an intimacy that I had never believed possible for me. An intimacy based not on possession or obligation, but on mutual respect, on conscious choice, on shared pleasure. We married in 1970, a simple ceremony in the garden of the health center, surrounded by friends, family, and many of the women I had helped over the years. It wasn't a traditional marriage in many respects. I kept my name, my financial independence, my direction of the center. Matthew moved into the small house I had built at the back of the center's grounds, not the other way around. "People talk, you know," my mother commented once, concerned. "They say it's not right for a wife to have more authority than her husband." "Let them talk," Matthew replied, with that calm smile that was his trademark. "What matters is that it works for us." And it did work, in ways I hadn't even imagined possible. Our partnership wasn't just personal, but also professional. Together, we expanded the scope of the health center, now officially called the Appalachian Valley Women's and Children's Health Center. Beyond care for pregnancy and childbirth, we began to offer pediatric services, family planning, prevention and treatment of sexually transmitted diseases. In 1972, our daughter, Clara, was born, conceived with love, gestated with care, brought into the world by the hands of Miss Louise herself, the midwife who had taught me everything she knew. The birth wasn't easy. 36 hours of labor, complications that required all of Miss Louise's skill and all of Matthew's medical knowledge. But when I finally held my daughter in my arms, I felt a connection with all the women who had come before me, all the mothers who had gone through this transformative experience, all the lives that had begun with that first powerful cry. Clara was followed 3 years later by Louis, a boy with curious eyes and an easy smile who won the hearts of everyone who met him. Raising my children was a healing experience in itself. Each bath given with care, each story read before bedtime, each hug freely offered was an affirmation that the cycle of trauma could be broken, that new ways of loving and caring were possible. Matthew and I had an explicit agreement about how to raise our children, with absolute respect for their bodies, their choices, their voices. We never forced them to hug or kiss anyone if they didn't want to, even if it was a close relative. We never devalued their fears or concerns, even if they seemed trivial to adult eyes. And above all, we never, ever sacrificed their safety and well-being for convenience or appearances. "Do you think we're overreacting?" I asked Matthew once, after we had refused to let Clara sleep at the house of a family we didn't know well, despite her insistence. "Maybe we're projecting our own fears onto her? Better to err on the side of too much caution than too little," he replied, always sensible. "And it's not about controlling, it's about protecting until she can protect herself." As my children grew, the health center also grew. What had begun as a small office behind a pharmacy became a complex of 3 buildings, with a team of nurses, midwives, a pediatrician, Matthew, and a psychologist who came from Charleston twice a month to attend more complex cases of trauma and postpartum depression. In 1980, when I was 39 years old, I was invited to give a lecture at the School of Medicine on the integration of traditional and modern medicine in serving rural communities. It was the first time that someone like me, a woman from the countryside, without formal medical training, was invited to speak in such a prestigious forum. "You've opened doors we didn't even know were closed," Dr. Helen told me, now director of the Millstone Regional Hospital and one of my oldest allies. "You've shown that knowledge doesn't belong only to academia, that wisdom can come from many sources." The 1980s were a period of recognition and expansion of our work. The health center was used as a model for similar programs in other parts of the United States. I received awards from the Department of Health, the Pan American Health Organization, from international foundations concerned with women's health in rural communities. But the most significant recognition, for me, came from the women of the Appalachian Valley themselves, the women who traveled days to see me, who entrusted their bodies, their secrets, their deepest fears to me, the women who named their daughters after me, who brought me the first fruits of their gardens, who fervently defended the center against any criticism. "You're not just a midwife or a nurse to us," Mary Jane once told me, one of the first women I had helped when I was still a 16-year-old girl learning from Miss Louise. "You're a symbol that we can be more than the world says we can be, that our voices matter, that our lives have value." These words touched me more deeply than any award or formal recognition, because deep down, that's what I had always wanted. Not just to heal physical wounds, but to help heal the deeper wounds of the soul, the wounds that come from being silenced, devalued, made invisible. As I grew older, I began to think more seriously about the legacy I would leave. My daughter Clara had followed in my footsteps, graduating in nursing and specializing in obstetrics. My son Louis had chosen a different path, law, with a focus on the rights of women and children. Both, in their own way, were continuing the work I had begun. But I knew I needed to do more, to reach further. In 1990, at 49 years old, I founded the Appalachian Traditional Midwives School, a training program that combined the ancestral knowledge of the region's midwives with modern techniques of asepsis, risk identification, and first aid. The school, operating in the facilities of the health center, attracted women from all over the Northeast and Midwest, some young, fresh out of high school, others older, experienced midwives seeking to update their knowledge. "You're creating an army," Matthew joked, observing the yard full of women of all ages, colors, and backgrounds, united by the desire to serve their communities. An army of caregivers. He was right, although I preferred to think of them as a network, a web of support extending through regions where doctors rarely reached, where hospitals were distant luxuries, where women still regularly died from perfectly preventable complications during childbirth. The following decades brought changes, some welcome, others painful. In 1995, Matthew suffered a heart attack while attending a child with severe pneumonia at the hospital. He survived, but was left with limitations that forced him to drastically reduce his clinical work. In 1998, my mother, who had been my pillar of support for so many years, passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 82. In 2003, my father followed her at 89, grumbling until the end about incompetent politicians and the absurd price of coffee. Each loss was a reminder of the fragility of life, of the importance of living fully, consciously, with purpose. I continued working at the center and the midwifery school well past the age when most people retire. Not out of financial necessity, but out of passion, out of commitment to the women who still needed what I had to offer. In 2011, at 70 years old, I finally reduced my workload, passing the direction of the center to Clara, who had become a respected professional in her own right. I didn't retire completely. I still attended some cases, still taught at the midwifery school, still participated in conferences and workshops when invited. But I began to dedicate more time to other passions: gardening, writing my memoirs, the tranquil company of Matthew, now also in semi-retirement. It was in this more contemplative phase of life that I began to reflect more deeply on the journey I had traveled. From the traumatized girl I had been to the woman I became, from the indescribable horror I had lived through to the purpose and meaning I had found, from the wounds that had marked me so deeply to the healing I had discovered and shared with so many others. I realized that the abuse I had suffered, as terrible as it was, didn't define me. It was a part of my story, yes, an important part that had shaped much of who I became. But it wasn't my whole story. It wasn't the only thing, not even the main thing, that had formed me as a person. What really defined me were the choices I had made afterward, the choice to seek help, to confront the truth, to transform my pain into purpose, to use my experience to help other women find their own voice, their own power, their own healing. And perhaps most important, what defined me were the relationships I had built along the way, with my mother, whose silent strength had sustained me in the darkest moments, with my father, whose journey from denial to acceptance, from criticism to support, had taught me that people can change, can grow, can learn to love better, with Matthew, whose patient and respectful love had shown me that intimacy can be safe, that vulnerability can be a source of strength, not danger, with my children, whose existence had given me the opportunity to create a new type of family based not on fear and silence, but on respect and honesty, and with the thousands of women I had attended over the decades, whose stories, struggles, and triumphs had intertwined with mine, creating a fabric of shared experience stronger than any of us could have created alone. Today, at 83 years old, I look back and see a life that, despite its traumatic beginning, was rich, full, and meaningful, beyond what I could ever have imagined in those dark days after the abuse. I see the more than 2,000 babies I helped bring into the world with my own hands. I see the hundreds of midwives I trained, who are now spread throughout America, carrying with them not just techniques and knowledge, but a philosophy of care that respects the intrinsic dignity of each woman. I see my children and grandchildren growing strong and secure, free from the legacy of trauma that could so easily have been passed on to them. And I see myself, not as a victim, not just as a survivor, but as a woman who chose, day after day, year after year, decade after decade, to transform darkness into light, suffering into healing, silence into voice. If there's a lesson I would like to leave for you who are listening to me now, it is this. Trauma can break us, yes. It can mark us in ways that never completely disappear. But it doesn't have to define us. It doesn't have to be the end of our story. It can be instead the beginning of a journey of healing that takes us to places we never would have imagined, that connects us with other wounded souls seeking light, that allows us to create meaning from suffering, purpose from pain. If you are going through your own journey of trauma and healing, know that you are not alone, that there are others who have walked this path before you, who understand the darkness, who know the weight, who know what it's like to struggle to find hope when everything seems lost. Know that healing is possible. Not perfect, not complete perhaps, but real, deep, and transformative. And know, above all, that your voice matters, that your story deserves to be heard, that your suffering deserves to be acknowledged, that you deserve to be protected, respected, valued. That is the truth that I took a lifetime to learn, and that I now share with you. We are stronger than we imagine, more resilient than we can believe, more capable of healing than we dare to hope. And when we unite, when we share our stories, when we validate each other's experiences, when we create safe spaces for truth to be spoken and heard, we can transform not only our own lives, but the world around us. My dears, before I finish, I want to thank each one of you who stayed until the end of this story. I know it wasn't easy to listen to, just as it wasn't easy to tell. If you were moved, if you found a little piece of yourself in this old lady and her journey, please leave your like and subscribe to Grandparents' Tales. Share with someone you think needs to hear that healing is possible, even after the most painful experiences. May God bless each one of you, and may you find, as I found, light even in the darkest moments, strength even in the greatest weaknesses, and love even after the deepest wounds.